The morning the auction notice went up on the door of Curtis Bait and Tackle, Dottie Lindgren had been awake since 3. She did not sleep much anymore. She had not slept properly since the September afternoon a year earlier, when her lawyer telephoned her from Sault Ste. Marie and said the words she had braced herself for and not believed she would hear. "We lost, Dottie. I'm so sorry. We lost." She was 74 years old that October. She had short white hair cut to ear length in a neat side part the way she had worn it since the late 1980s. She had pale, blue-gray eyes that her father had used to say were the color of the lake in November, and a long weathered face with high cheekbones tanned from a lifetime on the water. She stood 5 feet 7 inches without slouching, the way her mother had taught her. She had a face that held calm Upper Peninsula stoicism and quiet grief in equal measure. She had been a 4th-grade teacher at Curtis Elementary for 42 years. She had retired in 2015, and for 4 years she and her husband Owen had run his charter business together. Then Owen got sick. Then Owen died. Then she ran the charter 4 more years alone with a hired captain. Then the dock collapsed under the ice breakup on a windy March morning in 2024. Then the insurance company sent a denial letter on company letterhead. Then she sued. Then she lost. Then she sold the lodge. That was the order of it. By the time the dust settled in the spring of 2026, Dottie owned the small log and cedar cottage on Holm Road. Her father had left her in 1992, a 1978 Ford pickup with 210,000 miles on the odometer, an oak kitchen table she had grown up at, 11 boxes of 4th-grade textbooks, her wedding photograph, and her father's tools. That was the inventory of her life. She did not feel sorry for herself. She came from people who did not believe in self-pity. Her father had been a Marine. Her mother had been a teacher who lost her only brother at Iwo Jima and never spoke his name aloud again. She came from people who had been knocked down and had stood up again without remarking on the fact. But she had not laughed once since the phone call from her lawyer. She had noticed that somewhere in the spring. She had been peeling potatoes at the sink one evening, listening to a public radio program out of Marquette, and the announcer had told a quiet joke about a moose, and Dottie had heard herself not laugh. She had set the peeler down. She had thought, "Isn't that something?" And then she had finished peeling the potatoes. She did not feel defeated exactly, she felt finished. The two were not the same thing, but they sat next to each other on the shelf. That morning, the morning the auction notice went up, she'd been awake since 3 because the wind had shifted in the night and was coming down out of the north off the lake. The cottage on Holm Road sat in a draw between 2 cedar ridges, and when the wind came off the lake, the cottage made a small whistling sound at the eaves she had been hearing since she was a girl. She lay in her bed in the small north bedroom and listened to it the way she would have listened to her father's snoring through the wall when she was 10 years old. At 4, she got up. She put on her brick-red flannel work shirt, her faded blue jeans with the worn brown leather belt, her tan suede sorrel pack boots with the leather lacing. She tied a navy blue knit watch cap loose around the back of her head and pushed it back so the brim sat high on her forehead. She put on her round wireframe bifocals on their black neoprene retainer cord. At her throat hung a small silver fishhook on a steel chain, the one Owen had brought home for her from a tackle show in Green Bay in 1972, the year after they were married. On her left hand was her plain-worn gold wedding band. Over all of it she pulled on the oversized forest green canvas barn coat with the quilted lining that Owen had bought himself in 1983 and that she had been wearing in the place of her own coat since the funeral. She made coffee on the black, wood-burning cook stove. She drank the first cup standing at the window over the sink, looking out at the dark. She drank the second at the small white-painted kitchen table in the lamplight, listening to the wind, looking at the framed black-and-white wedding portrait of her parents above the cook stove. July 4th, 1947. Her mother was 25 in the photograph and not yet pregnant with her brother. Her father was 27 and home from the Marines for 8 months. They were standing on the steps of the Curtis Methodist Church. Her father was looking at her mother. Her mother was looking at the camera with a small, grave smile. The smile of a woman who has lost a brother on a black volcanic beach 4,000 miles away in the same year she is getting married. At 5:15, the eastern sky began to gray. She pulled on her gloves and let herself out the kitchen door and walked down the path toward the lake. It was a quarter mile from the cottage to the water. The path went down through paper birch and balsam fir, then through low blueberry barrens that had finished bearing in August, then out onto the small gravel shore where her father had taught her to fish for yellow perch 66 years before, where, 51 years before, she and Owen had skipped stones at 6 in the morning of their wedding day, where, 32 years before, she had spread her father's ashes in a slow line out into the shallow water, where, 2 years and 7 months before, the dock had splintered in the night under 3 feet of ice, driven by a storm out of Wisconsin. The dock was still there, or what was left of it, the splintered cedar pilings stuck up out of the still gray water at angles, like the broken teeth of an animal. She had not pulled them. She did not have the money to pull them. The contractor in Manistique had quoted her $14,000 in February, and she had laughed without any sound, the closest thing to laughter she had made in a year. She did not have $14,000, and she was not going to have $14,000, and so the pilings would stand in the lake until they fell, and she would walk past them every morning of whatever time she had left, and she would learn to look at them without feeling anything. She had not learned yet. She was working on it. The water was glass flat, the way Big Manistique was almost always glass flat in October before the November winds came. The mist sat on it in low pillows. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows 50 yards out. She stayed for 20 minutes. She did not cry. She had not cried since the autumn of 2025. She had not really cried since the lawyer's telephone call, which she remembered as a kind of stillness, not a weeping. The heron lifted slowly out of the shallows, beat its wings 4 times, and flew low over the water toward the south end of the lake. Dottie watched it go. She turned and walked back up the path toward the cottage. At 8, she pulled on her gloves and walked into town. Curtis was 1.25 miles from the cottage if you took the cutoff behind the schoolhouse. She took the cutoff. The morning had warmed to 43 degrees. The wind had dropped, and the maples on the cutoff path were the color of new copper pots. She kicked her feet through the leaves the way she had as a girl. There was no one else on the path. She came out behind the volunteer fire department garage and walked the half-block down Front Street to the Curtis Township office. It was the old Curtis Town Hall, built 1906, a small white clapboard building with a green pressed tin roof, and a stone step worn into a soft hollow by 90 years of feet. She paused at the green mailbox on the corner, dropped the water bill in, listened for the soft slap, and turned to step up to deliver the second envelope she was carrying, a property tax payment in cash. That was when she saw the notice. The bait shop sat directly across Lake Road from the township office. The bait shop was a small whitewashed cedar clapboard single-story building, 24 feet across, with a porch and twin church pew benches and a hand-painted red-on-white sign on the front gable that read bait, and then a long dash, and then tackle, and then another long dash, and then ice. There was a bell rope on the door. The window was boarded. The window had been boarded since the morning of May 20th, 2024. Old Pop Yancy Bjornstad had died in his cottage on Pop Yancy Road on the 19th alone, 88 years old, found by his neighbor Mary Cohell with a folded copy of the Curtis Township Weekly on his chest. His son Carl had flown in from Anchorage for the funeral, and had flown out 2 days later, and the shop had stayed shut, and the windows had stayed boarded, and the bell rope had hung still through 18 months. 18 months, by Dottie's count. 18 months that the bell over the door had not rung. 18 months that the heart of the village had been stopped. On the boarded plywood front door that morning, taped at eye height with 4 pieces of duct tape, was a fresh, yellowed paper notice on Mackinac County letterhead. She crossed Lake Road. She read the notice through her bifocals once, then a second time. Public auction. $1. Curtis bait and tackle. 14 Lake Road. The body explained that the building had been donated to the township by the estate of Yancy Olaf Bjornstad, with the stipulation that the township not sell it for profit or demolish it. The board would offer it at $1 public auction at the Mackinac County Courthouse in St. Ignace on Tuesday, October 27, 2026, at 4 in the afternoon, to any resident of Curtis Township who would commit an assigned conservation easement to operate the building as a bait shop or fishing tackle museum for a minimum of 3 years, and to restore the exterior to its 1960 appearance within 12 months. Dottie stood on the sidewalk in front of the boarded door for a long time. She did not move. The morning had warmed enough that her breath no longer fogged. A pickup truck rolled past on Lake Road, and the driver, who was Glenn Niemi, who had been in her 4th grade class in 1976, lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel, and Dottie lifted 2 fingers back without looking. She read the notice a 3rd time. She thought, I taught half this township to read. I will not be the woman who reads a notice 4 times. But she read it a 4th time. The words $1 were sitting at the top of the paper, and she could feel something inside her chest that she had not felt in 17 months. She did not know what it was yet. She did not give it a name. She thought of her father. She thought of him on a summer day in 1959 when she was 7 and he was 39, and he had pulled the family Ford station wagon onto the gravel apron in front of this very door on a July morning, and he had walked her up these very steps, holding her small left hand in his big right hand. She had been wearing a yellow gingham dress and white canvas keds. He had been wearing brown corduroy work pants and a green plaid shirt, and the same kind of navy blue knit watch cap she now wore pushed back on his own forehead. He had pushed the door of the shop open with his free hand. The bell rope had rung. The shop had smelled of pine plank and oiled cedar and minnow water, and the faint sweetness of Royal Crown soda. A young man, no older than 23, with sand-blonde hair and a Norwegian face, had looked up from the counter and grinned at them, and her father had said, "This is my daughter Dorothy. We are going fishing." And the young man had said, "Well now, Carl Holm. How about that?" Well now. The young man had been Yancy Bjornstad. The shop had been open 6 weeks. It had been her first time crossing the threshold. It would not be her last. She had not been inside the shop in 23 years. She had walked past it almost every week of those 23 years. She had stopped buying her own tackle in 2003 when Owen's Charter took over all the fishing she did. But she had passed it. She had heard the bell rope. She had nodded to Pop Yancy through the window, the way an old woman in a small village nods to an old man in a small village. And now Pop Yancy had been gone 18 months, and the bell rope was still, and the notice said $1. She turned around on the sidewalk. She crossed Lake Road back to the township office. She climbed the worn stone step. She opened the door. Constance Tibbetts, the township clerk, looked up from her desk. Connie had been one of Dottie's students in 1983. Connie was now 53 years old, with iron gray hair cut short and a navy cardigan, and reading glasses on a beaded chain not unlike Dottie's own. She said, "Morning, Mrs. Lindgren." Dottie said, "Morning, Connie. I have come about the auction." Connie set her pen down very slowly. She looked at Dottie for a moment over her reading glasses without saying anything. Then she said, "The bait shop auction." Dottie said, "That's right." Connie said, "All right then. Let me get you the paperwork." She rose and went to a small oak file cabinet against the back wall. She pulled open the top drawer. She took out a manila folder. She laid it open on the desk. She said, "The township is requiring 3 things, Mrs. Lindgren. A signed conservation easement to operate the building as a fishing-related concern for a minimum of 3 years. A signed restoration plan to bring the exterior back to its 1960 appearance within 12 months. And a personal appearance at the courthouse in St. Ignace next Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Dottie said, "Are there other bidders?" Connie said, with the conservation easement, "No, ma'am, there have not been." Dottie said, "All right, where do I sign?" Connie hesitated. She said, "Mrs. Lindgren, you don't want to take a couple of days to think about it." Dottie said, "Connie, I am 74. I do not have a couple of days." Connie nodded once. She turned the easement page around. She handed Dottie her own pen. Dottie sat down in the wooden chair across from Connie's desk. She put her bifocals on. She read the easement straight through. It took her 11 minutes. At the bottom of the third page, on the signature line, she wrote in her careful, steady cursive, the same cursive that had taught 1,000 fourth graders to form their own, the name Dorothy Holm Lindgren. She dated it the 21st day of October, 2026. She slid the paper back across the desk. She said, "What time do I need to be in St. Ignace next Tuesday?" Connie said, 3:30 would be safe. Dottie said, "I will be there at 3:15. She stood up. She handed Connie the cash tax envelope. She walked out the door, crossed Lake Road one more time, stood once more in front of the boarded door of the bait shop. She lifted her right hand, the way her father had taught her to lift her hand when she walked past a friend's house she could not stop at, and she touched 2 fingers to the boarded plywood. She said, out loud, in the empty Wednesday morning on Lake Road, the first thing she had said out loud to anyone other than herself in 3 days. She said, "Hold on, old shop. Hold on a little longer." Then she turned and walked the 1.25 miles home along the cutoff behind the schoolhouse, with her empty pockets and her gloved hands and her old man's barn coat. And she did not know yet that her father had been waiting for her on the back shelf of that building for 67 years. That night, after a supper of fried whitefish and boiled potatoes, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and remembered. She did not allow herself to remember her father often. Her father had been dead 34 years. She had learned, somewhere along the way, that grief is a thing you can hold in your pocket like a smooth stone for the rest of your life if you do not take it out and look at it too often. You can rub it with your thumb. You can know it is there. But if you take it out and hold it in your palm for too long, it will weigh 40 pounds instead of 40 grams. That night, she took it out and held it. It was a Sunday in July in 1959. The 12th of July, because in the cottage upstairs in her father's old steamer trunk, there was a black and white photograph her mother had taken. And on the back, her mother had written in pencil, "Carl and Dottie before fishing, July 12th, 1959. They had driven from the cottage on Holm Road into town that morning. He pulled the station wagon onto the gravel apron in front of the brand-new Curtis Bait and Tackle, which had opened the week before, because old Lars Bjornstad's boy, the one with the Army discharge papers and the German wife, had taken a loan from the Curtis Savings Bank and put it into a small shop, and her father felt that was a thing a man should walk in the door of and welcome. They walked in. The bell rope rang. The shop smelled of pine sap because the lumber for the new shelves had been milled 3 weeks before in McMillan from green white pine. It smelled of fresh paint and minnow tank water and Royal Crown soda and bug spray. It would smell like that in some combination for the next 65 years. Pop Yancy had stood up. He had said, "Well now, Carl Holm." He had been 23 years old, and he had grinned at her father with the open admiration of a young veteran for an older one. Her father had said, "Yancy, congratulations on the shop." He had shaken Yancy's hand. He had said, "This is my daughter Dorothy. We're going fishing, but first I want to look around." He walked the small shop with her hand in his. He read every label on every jar of pork rind strips. He picked up every spool of monofilament and looked at the test rating. He examined the musky tackle, then the base, then the fly fishing dries Pop Yancy was carrying as an experiment. He said, "You have got a good shop here, Yancy. You will keep this place running till you are an old man." Pop Yancy said, "Thank you, Mr. Holm. I sure aim to." Then her father walked back out to the station wagon, and he came back inside holding his own old maroon-painted Fall City brand tackle box from the war, about 14 inches long. The paint was scuffed. The latch was already bent from age. It was the tackle box he had carried with him to the Pacific in case he found himself with time to fish in some lagoon, and which he had carried home from Tinian to Curtis in 1946 in a duffel bag at the bottom of a transport ship. Dottie had not known that. She would not know it for 67 years. She had only known that her father loved the box. She had seen it on the high shelf of his workshop 100 times. She had been told never to touch it. That morning, he laid the tackle box on Pop Yancy's pine plank counter. He opened the latch. He lifted the cantilever tray. He said, "Yancy, take a look at this." Inside the cantilever tray, on a clean square of white cloth, lay a single hand-carved wooden lure, 4 inches long, shaped roughly like a perch fingerling. It was painted in faded yellow and green with small black dots along the back. There was a single rusted treble hook tied at the tail. There was a small brass eye screw at the nose. Her father said, "A fellow in my squad on Okinawa carved this for me. He carved it out of a piece of pine-packing crate from a USS LST landing ship. He gave it to me 3 days before he was killed. He said it would catch perch in the Great Lakes when I got home. He told me to think of him when I caught one with it." Pop Yancy looked at the lure for a long, quiet moment. He said, "Mr. Holm." "That is something." Her father said, "I caught a 16-inch of perch with it in 1947. I have not used it since. I thought you should see it." Pop Yancy said, "Mr. Holm, you ought to have that in a frame." Her father said no. He said it quietly. He said, "My wife does not want anything from the war in our house, Yancy. She lost her brother on Iwo. She does not want the reminders. He carved it for me to use. I will use it again before I die. But for now it lives in this box." Pop Yancy was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Holm, I would be honored to keep an eye on that box for you while you are looking at my shop today." Her father said, "Thank you, Yancy, I would appreciate that. Just leave it on the back shelf there." He pointed at the new maroon-painted metal shelving unit at the back of the shop, the same shelving unit that would stand in the same place for the next 67 years. He said, "Dorothy and I are going to walk down to the lake now. We will come back for the box on the way home." He ruffled Dottie's hair. He said, "Come on, Dot." They walked out of the shop. The bell rope rang behind them. Pop Yancy set the tackle box on the third shelf of the maroon shelving unit, with the rusted treble hook of the perch lure pointing toward the wall. He had not closed the latch. He had not tied a paper tag to the wire handle yet. He had not needed to. Dottie and her father walked to the lake. They fished for 2 hours from the small public dock at the end of Lake Road. They caught 7 yellow perch and a 14-inch smallmouth bass. They walked back along Lake Road at noon with the cleaned fish in a paper bag. They did not stop at Pop Yancy's shop on the way home. She would think about that later. She would think about it for the rest of her life. Her father was carrying the bag of fish. He was holding her hand again. They walked past the bait shop, and Pop Yancy waved at them through the front window, and her father waved back, and her father said, "We will come for the box tomorrow, Dot. Tomorrow's Monday. I've got to take the truck up to Newberry tomorrow afternoon. I will swing past Yancy's on the way through and pick it up." Tomorrow became Tuesday, and Tuesday became Wednesday, and Wednesday became the 3rd week of July, and the 3rd week of July became the 2nd week of August. When her father had been working at the loading dock of his hardware store and had felt his left arm go heavy, and had set down the crate he was carrying, and had walked into his office and sat down at his desk and dialed his wife at the school office and had said, "Maggie, something is wrong." Maggie had taken him to the hospital in Manistique. The doctor had said it was a stroke, a small one, a first one. Her father recovered most of the use of his left side over the following winter. He could walk again by Christmas, he could drive again by Easter. But he could not fish again. The stroke had taken the small, fine motor control he had needed to tie a fishing knot. He sat at the kitchen table with a length of monofilament and a number 6 hook and tried, and his fingers did not obey him. And after the third attempt, he set the line down very carefully and said to his wife, "Well, I am done fishing then." He had not gone back to Pop Yancy's shop. He had not asked Pop Yancy for the box back. Dottie had asked her father one Saturday in October, when he was sitting in his armchair with a wool blanket over his knees, whether they were going to go pick up his old tackle box from the bait shop, and her father had been quiet for a moment and had said, "In time, Dot." In time. In time had not come. In time had become his second stroke, in November of 1992, on a Wednesday morning at the kitchen table over a third cup of coffee at the age of 72. In time had become the small Marine Corps Honor Guard funeral at the Curtis Methodist Church and the folded flag on her mother's lap. In time had become the boxes in the attic that her mother had refused to open, and that Dottie had not opened for 2 years after her mother died in 2010, until one rainy Saturday in 2012, when she had finally climbed the attic ladder and catalogued the small life of a Marine Corps corporal, and had not found, anywhere in any of the boxes, the bronze star she knew her father had received in 1945, and that she had only ever seen once, when she was 4 years old, when her father had let her hold it in her palm for 30 seconds and had said, "This is a thing that does not live in this house, Dot. I love your mother. I am keeping it elsewhere. Someday I will show you where." Someday had also not come. Her mother had outlived her father by 18 years, and Dottie had outlived her mother by 16 years, and the medal had not turned up. And Dottie had eventually decided, in the patient way of an Upper Peninsula woman, that her father had perhaps given the medal away to a fellow Marine, or had placed it in his casket without telling anyone. She had stopped asking sometime in the year 2014. That night at her kitchen table in October of 2026, at the age of 74, with the auction notice copy folded in her coat pocket on the chair beside her, she remembered the box. She remembered the box for the first time in maybe 40 years. She remembered the maroon paint. She remembered her father lifting the cantilever tray. She remembered the carved wooden perch lure. She remembered Pop Yancy's face. She remembered the way her father had said, "Just leave it on the back shelf there." She set down her fork. She placed her right hand flat on the oilcloth. She breathed in once, and out once, the way her father had taught her to breathe when she was nervous before a spelling test in 3rd grade. She thought, "Well now." She thought, "Well now, Carl Holm." She thought, "Did you leave that old box on his back shelf for 67 years?" She did not let herself answer her own question. She did not let herself hope. She had not hoped for anything in 17 months, and she was not going to start hoping now over an old man's tackle box that was probably not even still on the shelf. Pop Yancy's son, Carl, had probably cleaned out the back room a week after the funeral. The box had probably been thrown out 2 summers ago. But she poured herself another cup of coffee, and she sat at her kitchen table with the lamp on, and she rubbed the smooth stone of her father's memory in her palm, and for the first time in 17 months she had something she had been afraid to have, which was a question she did not yet know the answer to. And the having of an unanswered question was a thing that had once been, in her earlier life, the closest thing she knew to hope. She drove the old Ford pickup 85 miles south on the morning of October 27th, 2026. She left the cottage at 12:30. She took US 2 east through Engadine and Nobbin Way, then south along the Lake Michigan shore. The leaves were past peak in the Upper Peninsula in late October. The hardwoods were stripped to bronze and rust, and a thin first snow lay across the shoulders of the road north of Epouffet. She reached St. Ignace at 2:45. She parked the pickup in the small public lot behind the Mackinac County Courthouse. She walked up the courthouse steps. She showed her driver's license at the security desk. She took the wide oak staircase up to the second floor. She found the small courtroom at the end of the hall. She arrived at 3:12. There was no one else in the room except a court clerk in a navy cardigan and a man in a forest green plaid jacket and iron gray hair sitting on the front bench with his hands folded on his knee. The man was Bill Sharma. 68 years old, retired forester for the Hiawatha National Forest, currently in his second term as Curtis Township Supervisor. He had been Owen's deer hunting partner from 1979 until Owen's death in 2019. He stood up when Dottie came through the door and walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. He said, "Dottie." She said, "Bill." He said, "You sure about this?" She said, "I am sure." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right then." He said, "You've got my vote." He said, "You know that." She said, "I know that." At 3:30 exactly, the Honorable Marion D. Pelletier, 61, the Mackinac County Magistrate, came in from a side door in a black robe with reading glasses on the tip of her nose. She sat down at the high oak bench. She said, "Mackinac County Tax Sale, 2026-482, public auction of the structure at 14 Lake Road, Curtis, Michigan, with conservation easement attached. Miss Tibbetts, please read the easement." Connie read it. It took 7 minutes. The magistrate said, "Are there any bidders?" There was a silence. The magistrate said, "Mrs. Lindgren." Dottie stood up. She had to use the bench in front of her to push off because her left knee had stiffened on the drive down. She straightened her green barn coat. She put her bifocals on the proper part of her nose. She said, "Your Honor, I would like to bid $1 for the bait shop." The magistrate said, "On what conditions?" Dottie said, "On the conditions of the conservation easement, signed by me last Wednesday. I will operate the building as a bait and tackle shop for a minimum of 3 years. I will restore the exterior to its 1960 appearance within 12 months. I commit to these conditions." The magistrate said, "Why are you doing this, Mrs. Lindgren?" There was a small silence. It was not, strictly, a legal question. The magistrate had grown up in the small town of Garden Corners and had known Owen since the late 1960s. Dottie said, "Your Honor, the bait shop is the heart of our village. It has been the heart of our village since 1959. My father walked me through that door for the first time on the 12th of July, 1959, when I was 7 years old, and Yancy Bjornstad was 23. The heart of a village should not stay stopped." The magistrate said, "No, ma'am, it should not." She lifted her gavel. She brought it down once on the small block of wood. She said, "Sold to Dorothy Holm Lindgren of Curtis Township, Mackinac County, Michigan, for the sum of $1 United States dollar, on the 27th day of October, 2026, with conservation easement attached, at 347 Post Meridium." The magistrate said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Lindgren. The bell rope is yours." Dottie said, "Thank you, Your Honor." She took her wallet out of the inside pocket of the green barn coat. She removed a single $1 bill, the same $1 bill she had folded into the wallet the night before. She walked up to the clerk's table and laid it down on the wood. Connie pushed a small carbon paper receipt across the table to her in return. Bill Sharma was already on his feet behind her with his hand out. He shook her hand. He said, "Mrs. Lindgren." He said, "Dottie, you did good." She drove home on US 2. She got to the cottage on Holm Road at 6:45 in the evening, in the long, blue October dusk. She did not turn on the kitchen lamp. She sat in the driver's seat of the cold truck in the cold driveway for a long time. She said out loud, in the silence of the cab, "Hold on, Daddy. I am coming for your box." She did not enter the shop until Saturday morning. 3 days passed between the auction and the first entry. She used the 3 days the way her father had taught her to use the 3 days before a hard piece of work, which was to lay her tools out clean on the workbench, to think about the order in which she would do the job, and to sleep enough that she would not be tired when she went at it. On Wednesday evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pencil, and she wrote out a cleaning order. She wrote it the way she had written out lesson plans for 42 years at Curtis Elementary. 1. Front porch. 2. Front counter and display cases. 3. Side shelves and racks. 4. Minnow tanks and live well at the rear. 5. Back room and storage shelves. 6. Restroom. 7. Floor. Window plywood comes off last. That had been her father's rule for any winter project. Light goes in last. You do the dirty work in the dark first. Then you open the windows and you let the new light in on the finished work. On Thursday, she drove the pickup the 11 miles to the small Curtis Mercantile in Engadine. She bought a galvanized mop bucket, a new long-handled push broom, 4 pairs of yellow rubber kitchen gloves, a gallon of Murphy oil soap, a 2-gallon spray bottle of vinegar and water, 3 packages of clean shop rags, a small case of Barkeeper's Friend, a box of trash bags, a pair of new fluorescent shop lamps with 250-foot extension cords, a roll of fresh paper toweling, a small Coleman propane heater. The Engadine grocer was Hap Nyberg, 65 years old, who had been one of her 4th graders in 1971. He said, "Mrs. Lindgren, what on earth?" She said, "Hap, I bought the bait shop on Tuesday. $1, at the courthouse with a conservation easement. I am opening it back up." Hap looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Mrs. Lindgren, that is the best news I have heard in 18 months. You tell me when you open. I will be the first man through that door." She said, "I will, Hap." At 6 o'clock on Saturday morning, October 31st, 2026, she drove the pickup the 1.25 miles into Curtis and parked it on the gravel apron in front of the bait shop. She sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel. She listened to the engine cool. She watched the gray dawn come up over the white-painted cedar clapboards. She felt the way she had felt on the first day of school every September of her teaching career, which was a slow, steady, careful nervousness that her father had told her when she was 22, and starting her first classroom in the fall of 1973 was the proper feeling a person ought to have before a thing that matters. He had said, "Do not trust a teacher who is not nervous on the first day of school. The day you stop being nervous is the day you have stopped caring." She picked up the small ring of keys Connie Tibbetts had handed her on Tuesday afternoon. She got out of the truck. She walked up the 3 wood steps of the front porch. She unlocked the front door. She had to push the door with her shoulder. The frame had swollen in the 18 months of damp. The door gave a small groan and swung in. The bell rope on its brass bell rang for the first time since May 19th, 2024. The sound froze her in the doorway. It was a soft, small, mid-tone brass bell. It was not loud. It was not pretty. It was the same bell Pop Yancy had hung over the door in August of 1959, when he opened the shop, and it had rung at the entrance of every customer for 65 years. The sound of it on a quiet October Saturday morning in an empty boarded shop with no other ear to hear it was the loudest sound Dottie had heard in 18 months. She stood in the open doorway. The cold air from inside the shop came past her face. It smelled of dust and of oiled cedar, and faintly of old minnow water gone stale in the bottom of empty tanks. It smelled of mouse droppings in the corners. It smelled of itself. She stepped inside. The front counter was a long pine plank counter 12 feet wide, scarred and polished by 65 years of fishermen leaning their forearms on it, 2 empty glass display cases. The cash register was an old chrome National Cash Register from 1958. Above the cash register, on a cedar plaque, the stuffed 38-pound 4-ounce muskellunge caught by Ralph J. Vanoy of Cleveland on the 14th of July, 1962. To the left, against the side wall, the wood-cased Royal Crown soda cooler from 1957. To the right, the four-tier maroon-painted metal shelving unit that held the inventory. Behind the counter, against the back wall, a black rotary dial wall telephone, a spiral-bound paper calendar from 2024 still pinned to the wall, open to May, a framed black-and-white photograph of Pop Yancy as a young man standing in front of the shop in August of 1959 on opening day. She had told herself on Wednesday at the kitchen table that she would not look for the box first. She would clean the shop in order. She would not skip ahead. She had said it out loud once on Thursday at the Engadine grocery and once on Friday at the kitchen sink. You do the front first, Dorothy Holm Lindgren. You do the work. You do not chase the answer. The answer will wait for you. You have waited 67 years. You can wait 11 more days. She turned and walked back out onto the front porch and began. She swept the leaves off the porch boards. She washed the porch with Murphy oil soap. She oiled the pew benches with linseed oil. Inside, she wiped 65 years of dust off the pine plank counter. She used Barkeeper's Friend on the chrome of the cash register. She cleaned the glass of the 2 display cases. She lifted the stuffed muskie down, dusted it, set it back. She took down the calendar from 2024, folded it once, placed it in a small, clean cardboard box she had set aside on the floor. She had decided, before she started, that she would not throw out any object of Pop Yancy's. She would keep everything. She would clean it. She would put it back. She would not throw out his small life with her own broom. She came back on Sunday. She came back on Monday. She came back every day for 10 days. She did the side shelves and the racks, taking every spool of monofilament off the wall in order, wiping the wood shelf clean, putting each spool back in the same place. She did the same with the jig heads, the split shot, the leaders, the foam floats, the MEPs, and lazy Ikes and head and plugs, which took her 3 hours by themselves. She scrubbed the 4 minnow tanks with vinegar and water. She tested the pumps. She scrubbed the live well. She did Pop Yancy's small back office with great care, reading each paper, making piles of bills she would pay, correspondence she would mail to Carl Bjornstad, personal items she would keep on the desk where she had found them. She did the toilet. She did the pine plank floor on her hands and her knees with a wool sponge and a bucket of warm Murphy oil soap water, the way her mother had washed the kitchen floor of the cottage every Saturday morning of Dottie's childhood. The floor came up the soft, warm, honey color of pine that has been walked smooth by 65 years of fisherman's boots. She did the backroom shelving last. It was the long wall of 4-tier maroon-painted metal shelves, where Pop Yancy had stored the seasonal stock and the unclaimed tackle and the customer leave-behinds. The customer leave-behinds were the things customers had brought in to be reeled or relined or simply held for the next trip up and had not picked up. There were perhaps 30 of them, each with a small yellowed paper tag tied to it in brown twine, in Pop Yancy's careful young or old handwriting depending on the year of the tag. She did not get to the 3rd shelf on Monday. She got to the 2nd shelf. She stopped at 4:15 in the afternoon when the light started to go, and her left knee began to ache. She drove home in the dusk. She did not sleep well that night. She slept about 3 hours. She lay in her bed and listened to the wind, and she felt the way she had felt the night before. Her first day teaching school, the night before her wedding day, the night before her father's funeral. She felt the long, slow tightening that does not have a name. She got up at 3:30, she made coffee, she drove into Curtis in the dark. She let herself into the shop at 4:50. She turned on the fluorescent shop lamps. She put on the rubber gloves. She walked to the back room. She turned on the small Coleman propane heater. She stood for a moment in front of the maroon shelving unit. She did not let herself look at the 3rd shelf yet. She made herself look at the floor. She said, out loud, to the empty back room, "Order, Dorothy, order." She began with the bottom of the third shelf. She worked down the third shelf in order, left to right, the way her father had taught her to read a shelf. She had 8 items left on the third shelf at 6 o'clock. She had 7. She had 6. She had 5. The 6th item was a small maroon-painted metal tackle box from the 1940s, 14 inches long, 6 inches wide, 6 inches deep, with a slightly bent latch and a wire handle. The paint was original. The maroon had faded to the color of dried blood. Tied to the wire handle with brown twine, in handwriting she had not seen since 1992, was a yellowed paper claim tag the size of a small library card. She did not have to read it to know what it said. She read it anyway. The tag said, in young Pop Yancy's careful 1959 cursive, Holm, left July 12th, 59. She did not move for a long time. She stood in front of the third shelf of the maroon metal shelving unit, in the soft slanted November dawn coming through the high side window of an old Upper Peninsula bait shop, in the same yellow rubber kitchen gloves, and the same green barn coat, and the same brick red flannel shirt she had been wearing for 10 days, and she looked at her father's handwriting, and at Pop Yancy's handwriting, and at the small maroon-painted box of a Marine Corps corporal of the 6th Marine Division, who had carried it across the Pacific in 1944 and home to Curtis in 1946, and laid it on this shelf on the 12th day of July, 1959. She thought, in the back of her mind, with a small Upper Peninsula precision, that the date on her watch was November 11th. She thought, Veterans Day. She thought, well, of course it would be today. She reached out her right hand. Her hand was steady. She had not expected her hand to be steady. Her hand was steady because the steady part of her was older than the shaken part of her, and the steady part of her had been her father's part. And her father did not shake. She touched the paper tag with the tips of her fingers. The twine was dry. The paper was brittle. The handwriting had faded, but it had not run. Pop Yancy had written it with a sharpened No. 2 pencil on Sunday afternoon, July 12th, 1959, after Carl Holm and his small daughter had walked out of the shop and not come back for the box. He had been a Norwegian man of his generation. You hold a thing for a friend until the friend asks for it back. If the friend dies, you keep holding it. You do not unsteward. He had held it 67 years and 4 months. Dottie lifted the box off the shelf with both hands. She carried it slowly, the way her father had carried small wounded animals when she was a girl, to the long pine plank counter at the front of the shop. She set it down in the center of the counter. She stepped back. She looked at it. She said, in the empty shop, on the Wednesday morning of November 11th, 2026, at 6:23 in the morning, with the soft, slanted November dawn light coming through the just-cleaned front windows and pooling on the soft, warm pine plank counter and on the faded maroon paint of a Falls City brand metal tackle box from 1943. I am here, Daddy. She said it quietly. She said it the way her father had used to call to her up the stairs of the cottage on Holm Road on Sunday mornings before church. The way he had said it 18 years before she was born, calling to the daughter he did not yet have. She said it again. I am here, Daddy. Then she stepped forward to the counter and reached out her hand and laid her fingers on the bent latch of the box. She lifted the latch. The latch resisted for half a second and then released with a small dry click, the way the latch had clicked in 1945 on Okinawa, and in 1946 on Tinian, and in 1947 at the kitchen table, in the cottage on Holm Road, and on every Sunday morning her father had opened it before church. She lifted the lid. The smell that came out of the box was the smell of old, oiled metal and dried pine. It was the smell of her father's workshop in the cottage basement when she was 8 years old. It was the smell of a small enclosed Marine Corps space that had not been opened in 67 years, and that was, in its own way, holding the breath of 1959 for her. The cantilever tray was lifted forward by a small brass hinge. It tilted toward her. The contents sat in 3 small wooden compartments separated by quarter-inch pine dividers, all original. In the leftmost compartment, 6 head and river runt lures from the 1950s, in their original red and white and yellow and black and frog-pattern paint schemes, the treble hooks rusted to brittle filigree. In the middle compartment, 2 faded yellow Lazy Ike plugs with brown spotting, a battered green and white bomber spin stick with a chipped jaw, 3 pre-1959 brass snap swivels, a small coil of green-braided Dacron line on a wooden spool no longer made. In the rightmost compartment, a single Mepps Aglia size 5 spinner with a copper blade and a hand-tied black bucktail, the blade tarnished but the bucktail intact, and at the bottom of the compartment beneath a small square of yellowed cotton flannel, the hand-carved wooden perch lure her father had shown to Pop Yancy on the morning of July 12, 1959. She lifted the perch lure out very carefully. It was 4 inches long. It was carved from a piece of pine packing crate from a USS landing ship tank that had brought rations and ammunition to the south beaches of Okinawa in April of 1945. It was painted in faded yellow and green with small black dots along the back, the way a yellow perch fingerling looks in the shallow water of Big Manistique Lake in late June. The single rusted treble hook at the tail was tied with a clean square knot in 1945 vintage cotton fishing line. The small brass eye screw at the nose was still firm. She held it in her left palm for a long moment. It weighed less than a coin. It had been carved by a young man named Henry Eldridge of Falmouth, Massachusetts, age 20, Private First Class, USMC, 6th Marine Division, 22nd Marines, Company F. Henry had carved it for Carl Holm on the evening of May 12, 1945, in the staging trench on the north side of Half Moon Hill, 3 days before the Sugar Loaf assault. He had handed it to Carl with a small grin, and had said, "Here, Holm, you said you fish for perch in the Great Lakes. Catch one with this when you get home. Think of me." Henry had been killed by sniper fire at 3:20 in the afternoon of May 15th on the slope of Sugar Loaf, 11 feet from where Carl had been hit in the left thigh. Dottie laid the perch lure carefully back into its compartment, on its small square of yellowed cotton flannel, in the same orientation it had lain since July of 1959, with its head pointing south. She closed her eyes for one long breath. She opened them. She lifted the cantilever tray out of the box by its small brass center handle. She set the tray aside on the pine counter to her right. The lower compartment of the tackle box was deeper. It was about 4 inches deep. It held, in its center, a single object. A small, dark blue cotton drawstring pouch, the size of a man's clenched fist, tied at the top with brown twine. She lifted it out with both hands. The pouch was made of a heavy navy blue cotton sateen, the kind a Marine Corps quartermaster in 1945 would have issued to a corporal for the carrying of small valuables. The seams were hand-sewn. The drawstring was a length of brown shoelace tied in 2 flat overhand knots. The cotton was soft from age. She set the pouch on the pine counter. She sat down on the wooden stool behind the counter. She untied the drawstring slowly, 1 knot at a time. She did not pull. She did not rush. She loosened the throat of the pouch, and she opened it like an envelope. Inside the pouch were 4 objects. The first was a small black and white photograph, 2.5 by 3.5 inches, with a white deckled border. The photograph showed a tall, thin young man in United States Marine Corps, dress blues, age 25, standing on the porch of a small wood-frame hospital with the sun behind him so his face was half in shadow. He was looking at the camera with a small, private smile. On the back of the photograph, in pencil in his own hand, Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, July 28, 1945. Released for redeployment, Tinian, August 1st. The second object was a folded engraved citation card on heavy cream-colored paper stock, 6 inches by 4 inches, dated 21 June 1945. She unfolded it on the counter with both hands. The card read, in heavy engraved black serif type, citation for Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device, Holm, Carl A., Corporal, United States Marine Corps, 22nd Marines, 6th Marine Division, for heroic achievement in connection with operations against the enemy on Okinawa Shima, Ryukyu Islands on May 15 to 16, 1945. On the reverse slope of Sugar Loaf Hill, during the second assault, Corporal Holm voluntarily exposed himself to intense enemy mortar and small arms fire to evacuate 2 wounded squad mates, carrying each in turn over a distance of approximately 240 yards to a covered position. Following the second evacuation, despite having received a penetrating wound to his own left thigh from enemy mortar fragmentation, Corporal Holm returned a third time under direct enemy sniper fire to recover the body of a fallen Marine. His prompt, courageous, and unselfish action under fire reflects great credit upon himself and was in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The citation was signed at the bottom by Major General Lemuel C. Shepard, Jr., Commanding General 6th Marine Division. She read the citation through twice. She did not make it through the second reading without crying. The third object was the Bronze Star Medal itself, a bronze 5-pointed star, 1.5 inches across, suspended from a red ribbon with a thin white center stripe edged with dark blue. Affixed to the ribbon, just above the star, a small bronze V for Valor device, 3/8 of an inch tall. The back of the medal was engraved in small, clear letters. Heroic or Meritorious Achievement, Carl A. Holm, CPL, USMC. The fourth object was a small folded scrap of paper, 2 inches by 3 inches, torn from the back of a Curtis Methodist Church bulletin, dated July 12, 1959. The dated portion was visible on the back of the scrap, the Sunday bulletin from the day Carl had carried Dottie into Pop Yancy's shop. On the blank reverse, in Carl Holm's careful pencil hand, for Dottie when she is old enough to know the price. K. She did not move for a long time. She sat on the wooden stool with her hands flat on the pine counter on either side of the open pouch, and she looked at the 4 objects laid out in front of her in the order in which she had drawn them from the bag, and she did not think anything in particular. She did not think because there were no words yet in her head for what her father had done. After perhaps 8 minutes, she lifted the small bronze star medal off the cotton pouch with her right hand. She held it on the open palm of her left hand. The bronze was cool. The ribbon was faded, but it was unfrayed. The V for Valor device caught a small spark of the November dawn light. She said, into the empty shop, in her own clear teacher's voice, the same voice with which she had read aloud to 42 years of 4th graders. For Dottie, when she is old enough to know the price. She knew, by the time she finished saying the words, that he had laid the box on the shelf that morning in July 1959, without intending to leave it there. He had intended to come back the next day, but he had also known, the way men of his generation knew without admitting they knew, that he was 40 years old, and that his father had died of a stroke at 41, and that there was a chance he would not come back to the shop on Monday, and he had put the bronze star in the lower compartment of the box that morning before he left the cottage, with the small folded note, so that if he did not come back to the shop, the box would lie on Pop Yancy's shelf until Dottie was old enough to know the price. She had not been old enough at 7. She had not been old enough at 14. She had not been old enough at 22 when she started teaching, or at 36 when she finally believed she would not have children, or at 41 when her father died, or at 67 when Owen died and she thought she had learned what loss was, or at 73 when she lost the dock and the savings and the lawsuit. She was, perhaps, old enough now. She was 74. She had walked into Pop Yancy's shop. She had stood at the back shelf. She had carried his box to the counter. She had untied his pouch. She had read his note. She had seen his medal. She was old enough. The price had been a young man named Henry Eldridge from Falmouth, Massachusetts, aged 20. The price had been two squad mates Carl Holm had carried 240 yards each down the reverse slope under enemy fire. The price had been a brother of her mother named Henry Sundberg of Curtis, Michigan, 21 years old, who had been killed at Iwo Jima on the same morning the photograph of the flag was taken on Mount Suribachi, and whose name her mother had not spoken aloud once in 65 years. The price had been her father's silent decision in 1947 to never let any of it enter the home of the woman he loved. She sat on the stool. She held the medal on her open palm. She did not weep loudly. She wept the way an Upper Peninsula woman of 74 weeps, which was a slow, steady welling that ran down both sides of her face in clear lines and dropped 2 and 3 drops at a time onto the brick-red flannel of her work shirt below her throat. She let it come for 17 minutes. When it stopped, she folded the citation card. She tied the pouch back closed with the brown twine. She placed the medal back inside the pouch first, then the citation card, then the photograph, then the bulletin scrap. She tightened the drawstring. She set the pouch carefully into the center of the lower compartment of the tackle box. She lowered the cantilever tray back into place above it. She closed the lid. She did not latch it. She picked up the tackle box. She carried it out to the truck. She locked up the shop. She drove home with the tackle box on the passenger seat. She did not turn on the truck radio. She did not look at the box. She did not turn left at the Holm Road cutoff. She turned right onto County Road H 42 and drove the 2 miles to the east edge of Curtis Township and turned in at the wrought iron arch of the Curtis Township Cemetery. It was 4:15 in the afternoon by then. The November light had begun to thin. The cemetery sat on a low rise above the road, with white birches at the perimeter and 140 headstones running back through the cleared field in even rows. She parked the truck at the gate. She lifted the tackle box from the passenger seat. She carried it in both hands. She walked the gravel path slowly. She knew the way. Her father's grave was in the 3rd row from the back, 8 headstones in from the left, beside her mother's. Low gray granite headstones, both. Her father's read, Carl Anders Holm, CPL, USMC 22, Marines 6MAR, DIV 1920 to 1992, Sugar Loaf 1945. Her mother's read, Margaret S. Holm, his wife, 1922 to 2010. A small American flag on a wire staff stood at the base of her father's headstone. It had been placed there by the Curtis American Legion Post on the morning of November 11th by old Bill Carlson, 81, the post's last surviving Vietnam veteran. Dottie knelt down on the grass. The cold of the ground came up through her jeans. She set the tackle box on the grass to her left. She placed her right hand flat against the gray granite of her father's headstone. The stone was cold. A flight of geese went over high to the west. She said, out loud, to the stone in the small, cold November dusk, "Hello, Daddy," she breathed. She said, "I came home defeated. I had nothing. I lost the dock, I lost the lawsuit, I lost the lodge, I lost the boats. I did not know what I was. I did not know what was left." She breathed. She kept her hand on the stone. She said, "I bought the bait shop. I bought it for $1 from the Curtis Township Board last Tuesday. I bought it because the bell rope had been still for 18 months, and I did not want the bell to be still any more. I bought it because Pop Yancy was a good man. I bought it because I remembered you walking me through that door in 1959. She stopped. She closed her eyes for a long moment. She said, "I found your box." She opened her eyes. She said, "I found your box on the 3rd shelf of his maroon shelving on Wednesday, November 11th, 2026, at 6:23 in the morning, with his paper tag still on the wire handle in his own 1959 handwriting." I have it here, Daddy. I'm sitting in front of you with your box on the grass beside me. She lifted her hand from the stone. She picked up the tackle box. She set it on her knees. She opened the lid. She lifted the cantilever tray. She took the dark blue cotton pouch out of the lower compartment. She loosened the drawstring. She poured the 4 objects out onto her open palm, the perch lure first, and the photograph, and the citation card, and the medal last. She held them up so the stone could see them. She said, I have your medal, Daddy. I have your citation. I have Henry Eldridge's perch. I have your photograph from Pearl Harbor. I have your note. She let the silence sit for a long moment. She said, I do not blame you for not telling me. I know why you did not tell me. I know about Mama's brother, I know. She looked down at the medal on her palm. She looked at the V device. She said, Daddy, I came home defeated. And you came home with a bronze star and did not tell me. And maybe coming home is enough. Maybe coming home is the only kind of victory there is. She bent her head. She wept for the second time that day, more quietly. She let it run down. When it had stopped, she put her right hand back on the gray granite of her father's headstone. She left it there for a long time. The dusk thickened. The first stars came up over the cedars at the back of the field. Her knees ached on the cold ground. She did not move. At 5:20 in the evening, she said, in a small, clear voice, to the stone, I will reopen the shop in the spring, Daddy. I will reopen it on the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. I will put your medal in a small frame on the back wall. I will let every customer who buys a fishing license know whose hand was on the door of that shop on the 12th of July, 1959. I will not put your name in big letters on the sign because you would not have wanted me to, but I will put it in the small letters, where the people who know how to look will see it. She breathed in. She breathed out. She said, I love you, Daddy. I am old enough now. I know the price. She tied the cotton pouch back closed. She set the 4 objects gently into the lower compartment of the tackle box. She closed the cantilever tray. She closed the lid. She latched it carefully. She stood up. Her left knee gave a small popping sound, and she steadied herself on the headstone for a moment, the way a daughter who is still a daughter would steady herself on her father's shoulder. She walked back to the truck in the dark with the tackle box in both hands. She called Mose Klinger at 7 in the morning. Mose was 62 years old and lived in Cedarville, 2 hours east of Curtis on the Lake Huron side of the Upper Peninsula. He had captained Owen's smallest charter boat for 15 years before he retired in 2021 with a bad back and a pension from the Hessel Marina. He and Owen had been friends since 1978. Owen had said on his hospital bed in March of 2019 that Mose Klinger was the most honest man he had ever known. Mose answered on the 3rd ring. He said, Dottie, you're up early. Is something wrong? She said, Mose, I bought the bait shop. There was a small silence. Then Mose said, Dottie? Which bait shop? She said, Curtis Bait and Tackle. I bought it for $1 at the courthouse last Tuesday. I have been cleaning it out for 10 days. I open in the spring, Memorial Day weekend, and I need a man to run the bait tanks. There was a longer silence. Then Mose said, What does it pay? She said, $15 an hour, 30 hours a week from April 1st through October 15th, 20 hours a week through the winter, no benefits, but I will hold a key, and you will share the early morning shift with me from 5 a.m. to 1 p.m., and you will get to live the rest of your retirement in a heated bait shop overlooking Big Manistique Lake, which is more than you deserve. Mose said, I am moving to Curtis on April 1st. She said, You do not need to be sure. Mose said, Dottie, he said, Dottie, Owen would have killed me if I had said anything else. I am moving on April 1st. Do not call anyone else for the tanks. She said, All right then. She called Tess Brendlinger at 9. Tess was 28 years old and was Pop Yancy's great-granddaughter. She had come back to Curtis in 2025 to do field research on yellow perch populations in Big Manistique Lake for her PhD dissertation at Northern Michigan University in Marquette. She was renting a small, two-room cabin on Wagstaff Lane half a mile west of the bait shop. She had been raised in Alaska, but had spent every summer of her childhood with Pop Yancy at the shop from age 6 to age 19, and she could clean a tank, sex a chub, and tie a clinch knot faster than anyone in the township under 50. Tess picked up on the fourth ring. She said, "Mrs. Lindgren." Dottie said, "Tess? I am sorry to call you so early." Tess said, "It is 9 in the morning, Mrs. Lindgren." Dottie said, "Tess, I bought your great-grandfather's shop. I bought it for $1 at the courthouse last Tuesday from the township. I am reopening it on Memorial Day weekend in 2027. I would like you to be my partner." There was a long silence on the line. Then Tess said, "What do you mean, a partner?" Dottie said, "I mean a 10% equity partner. I mean that when the shop turns over, 10% of the profits go into an account in your name, and when I die, 25% of the building and the inventory becomes yours. I mean that you will help me run the operation alongside your dissertation, you will set the perch tackle lineup, you will run the live bait program from the lake. I mean that the shop has to belong to a Bjornstad as well as a Holm. It would not be right otherwise." There was another long silence. Then Tess said in a small voice that she did not have full control of, "Mrs. Lindgren." He left the shop to the township. The township sold it to you. You do not owe me anything. Dottie said, "Tess, I am not paying a debt. I am keeping a shop alive." Pop Yancy held a thing for my father for 67 years. He held it because that was the kind of man he was. I am asking you to come hold this with me. I am 74. I cannot hold it alone. There was a third silence. Then Tess said in a steady voice, "Yes." Dottie said, "Yes, you will." Tess said, "Yes, I will." Dottie said, "All right then. Come for supper on Friday. We will sit at the kitchen table and we will draw up the agreement. I will write it out. We will get it notarized in Manistique on Monday." Tess said, "Mrs. Lindgren, he always said you were the smartest fourth-grade teacher in Mackinac County." Dottie said, "Tess, your great-grandfather was wrong. I was the second smartest. Mrs. Pakala had me by a mile." Tess laughed. It was the first laugh Dottie had been the cause of since the spring of 2025. She did not laugh herself, but she made Tess laugh, and the sound of a young woman laughing in her ear over the kitchen telephone on a Thursday morning in November was a sound she was not prepared to be moved by. And she was moved by it, and she stood at the kitchen telephone with her left hand on the wall, and she thought, well, maybe it is starting. The first thing she did that afternoon was call the framer at the Gladstone Frame and Photo on Highway US 2. She drove down on Friday morning in the truck. She walked into the framer's shop with the dark blue cotton pouch in the inside pocket of her green barn coat. She asked the framer, a 68-year-old man named Gust Skanis, whose father had been a Marine in Korea, if he would be willing to frame, with archival materials and an oxygen-free seal, a 45-year-old bronze star medal with citation card and a single photograph and a small piece of paper for a frame to be hung on the back wall of a small bait shop in Curtis, where the medal had been hidden by accident for 67 years. Gust Skanis listened to her for a long time without interrupting. When she had finished, he said, "Mrs. Lindgren, I will not charge you for the frame." She said, "Mr. Skanis, I will pay you." He said, "You will not." He said, "My father was a Marine. I will not." She said, "Mr. Skanis, then I will give you a Sugar Loaf medallion for your tackle box when the shop opens." He said, "Mrs. Lindgren, that I will accept." He framed it that afternoon, with archival mat board the color of cream, the citation card laid flat in the upper left, the photograph in the upper right, the bronze star centered below, and the small bulletin scrap with Carl's pencil note tucked at the bottom right. He sealed the frame with archival adhesive. He put an inert glass face on it. He cut a small dark walnut frame 3 inches deep. He handed it to her in a soft cotton wrapping bag at 4 in the afternoon. He would not take $1. She hung it on the back wall of the bait shop on Saturday morning, behind the cash register, beside the framed photograph of Pop Yancy from August of 1959. She mounted a small brass picture lamp above it on a swinging arm so she could turn the light on for any customer who asked. She unboarded the front windows on Tuesday with a flathead screwdriver and a small pry bar. The plywood had been screwed up with 8 long deck screws in the spring of 2024. She backed them out one at a time. The first sheet of plywood came down at 11:20 on Tuesday morning. The second came down at 12:18. She wiped down the front window glass on both sides with vinegar and clean newspaper. She stepped back into Lake Road and looked at the shop. The shop looked the way it had looked on a Saturday afternoon in 1965. The whitewashed cedar clapboards were yellowed by 65 years of weather, but they held. The hand-painted sign on the front gable read, "Bait, Tackle, Ice." A pickup truck rolled past on Lake Road. The driver was Hap Nieberg of the Engadine Grocery, who had told her 3 weeks before that he would be the first man through her door. He slowed to a crawl. He rolled down the window. He shouted across the road, "When do you open, Mrs. Lindgren?" She shouted back, "Memorial Day weekend, Hap. Saturday, May 30th. Be here at 6. He shouted, 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. She shouted, 6 a.m., Hap. Be here at 6. He shouted, I will be here at 5:30. He waved. He drove on. Through the winter, she carved the medallions. She had bought a 4-foot length of clear western red cedar from the millwork in McMillan on November 23rd for $42. She had cut it into 8 half-inch boards at the table saw in her father's old garage. She had then cross-cut each board into 3-inch squares. She had filed each square into a soft 3-inch oval with a small bench knife and a wood file. She had carved a stylized Sugar Loaf Hill silhouette on the obverse of each medallion, working from a small black and white photograph she had found in her father's papers of the Sugarloaf assault, as seen from the 6th Division observation post on the morning of May 16, 1945. On the reverse, she carved, in clean small block letters, K-A-H, above 6 Mardiv, above Okinawa, above 1945. She painted the silhouette in a faded blue-gray watercolor. She varnished each medallion with 2 coats of marine-grade spar varnish. She drilled a small 1/8-inch hole through the top for the leather thong. She carved 1 medallion a night through November and December and January and February and March and April. She carved them at the round oak kitchen table in the cottage on Holm Road, by the warm yellow-orange firelight of the cast-iron wood stove, with a brown canvas drop-cloth on the table and the small Coleman lantern lit. She carved them after supper, in the quiet hours from 6 to 9. She kept a tally in the back of her yellow legal pad. By Memorial Day weekend, she had carved 641 medallions. The 641st she would frame and hang on the back wall beside her father's bronze star. She wrote letters to the 28 families of unclaimed tackle leave-behinds. 11 of them wrote back, saying they would come to the opening. She wrote letters to the 7 living 6th Marine Division veterans she could find through the National Marine Corps Museum's archive office, asking if they would be willing to write a sentence about Sugar Loaf Hill for a small wall mounting beside Carl's medal. 3 wrote back. The oldest, 99 years old in a nursing home in Tacoma, Washington, wrote in a shaky hand, I was on the southwest slope on the morning of the 16th. I did not know Carl Holm. I know what he carried up that hill. Tell his daughter I send my respects. She mounted the 3 letters in a small cedar frame on the back wall beside the bronze star. She hired the McMillan millwork to repaint the bait, tackle, ice sign on the front gable in the same hand-lettered red-on-white that Pop Yancy's Uncle Olav had painted in 1959. She added, in smaller letters below, the new name of the shop, Lindgren and Holm. The painter, a 61-year-old woman from McMillan named Inga Sari, whose mother had hand-lettered the original sign, did the work in 2 days in late April. She and Tess and Mose stocked the shop in the second week of May. They installed 2 new bait tanks alongside the original 4. They ran new air lines. They stocked monofilament and braided line in 9 weights and 12 colors. They stocked musky tackle, walleye tackle, bass tackle, panfish tackle. They restocked Royal Crown soda in the wood cooler, which Mose had repaired by replacing a compressor relay in March, and added squirt and bubble up. They put a fresh tally pad next to the cash register for live bait orders. On Friday afternoon, May 29, 2027 at 4 o'clock, Dottie hung the bell back on its proper hook over the front door. She tugged the rope once. The bell rang. It rang the way it had rung on her father's hand on July 12, 1959. She and Tess and Mose stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the bell rope. Mose said, "Well." He said, "Well, we are open tomorrow." Tess said, "We are." Dottie said, "All right then." The morning of Saturday, May 30th, 2027 was clear and warm. The maple trees at the cottage on Holm Road were in full new leaf. The lake was the soft green blue of late spring. The wind was from the south, off Lake Michigan, 6 miles an hour. She dressed in the bedroom mirror. She put on her brick-red flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, her faded blue jeans, her tan suede sorrel pack boots laced with leather, the same green canvas barn coat she had been wearing for 2 years, the same navy blue knit watch cap pushed back on her head, the same round wireframe bifocals on the same black neoprene retainer cord, the same small silver fishhook on the steel chain at her neck, the same plain worn gold wedding band on her left hand. She had not bought new clothing for the opening. She was not the new thing. She drove the Ford pickup into Curtis at 5:15 in the morning. Moses' truck was already parked at the back of the building. The shop windows were already lit. The bait tanks were already pumping. Mose had been there since 4:30. Tess had arrived at 4:45. At 5:30, when Dottie pulled up at the gravel apron in front, the first 3 pickup trucks were already lined up on Lake Road, with their drivers standing on the sidewalk. Hap Nieberg's pickup was at the front of the line. Hap was leaning against the front fender of his truck in a clean red plaid shirt and a fresh-shaved face, smoking the one cigarette of the year he allowed himself, which was always on a Memorial Day morning. Dottie got out of her truck. Hap dropped the cigarette and stepped on it and walked over. He said, "Mrs. Lindgren," she said, "Hap." He said, "You ready?" She said, "I am ready." He said, "You been ready since 1959, she said, "Hap." "Hush." He grinned at her. He stepped back. She walked up the porch steps. She paused at the front door. She turned around once and looked at Lake Road in the early light. The line of pickups had grown to 8 in the time she had walked from her truck to the porch. By 6 o'clock, there would be 40. She turned back. She put her hand on the brass doorknob. She turned it. She pushed the door open. The bell rang. She stepped inside. Tess and Mose were behind the counter in the fresh khaki shirts. Tess was 28 years old and grinning. Mose was 62 years old and was wearing the same brown leather suspenders he had worn on Owen's charter boats for 15 years. The shop was filled with the smell of fresh coffee from a percolator on the backroom hot plate, and the wood-cased Royal Crown cooler was humming, and the 4 original aluminum minnow tanks and the 2 new ones were all gently aerating. Dottie walked to the back wall. She switched on the brass picture lamp over the dark walnut frame holding her father's bronze star, his citation, his Pearl Harbor photograph, and the small bulletin scrap with his pencil hand reading, "For Dottie when she is old enough to know the price." The lamp threw a soft, warm cone of light onto the metal. She walked back to the counter. She picked up the small cedar box on the front counter that held the 640 hand-carved Sugar Loaf medallions, each with a fresh leather thong tied through the small hole at the top, The thongs had been knotted by the residents of the Curtis Methodist Church Women's Circle, who had heard about the medallions from Connie Tibbetts and had asked, in a delegation of 4 ladies on Easter Sunday afternoon, whether they might have the privilege of knotting the leather. They had brought casseroles. They had spent 3 Saturday afternoons in February in the kitchen of the Curtis Methodist Church basement, nodding and laughing and telling stories about Pop Yancy and Carl Holm and Owen Lindgren. And Dottie had sat at the head of the table and had listened, and had, by the end of the 3rd Saturday in February, allowed herself, for the first time since the autumn of 2025, a small, dry, single laugh at one of Mary Cohel's stories about her late husband Bert, and a 14-pound walleye and a stuck zipper. A small, single dry laugh in February. That had been the start of it. Dottie carried the cedar box of medallions to the front of the counter. She set it down. She walked to the front door. She pulled the bell rope a second time. She held it. She nodded at Mose. Mose nodded back. He turned the key in the door lock. She opened the door. Hap Nyberg was the first man in the line. He took his cap off at the threshold. He stepped through the door. The bell rang a 3rd time. Hap said, "Mrs. Lindgren." He said, "Well, now." He said, "Well, now, Mrs. Lindgren." Dottie said, "Hap, what can we sell you?" Hap said, "A Michigan fishing license, and 6 dozen night crawlers, and a tin of bug spray, and a Royal Crown soda." Dottie said, "That comes to $46.18. Hap pulled a folded 50 out of his shirt pocket. He handed it to her over the pine counter. He said, "Keep the change, Mrs. Lindgren. Put it in the medallion jar." Dottie said, "What medallion jar?" Hap said, "The one you are going to put on the counter for tips. Mrs. Lindgren, put it in there." She rang up the order on the chrome National Cash Register from 1958. The bell of the register chimed for the first time since May 19, 2024. She gave Hap his change in cash, and she did indeed take the $3.82 over and laid it on the counter beside the cedar medallion box, and she said, "Well, all right then. There is your jar." She reached into the cedar box. She lifted out a single hand-carved sugar loaf medallion with its soft brown deerskin thong, the side with the silhouette facing him. She held it out across the counter. She said, "Hap, this is for your tackle box." Hap took it. He looked at it. He read the carved letters on the reverse. He said, K-A-H. He said, "Carlander's home." Dottie said, "That is my father." Hap said, "Mrs. Lindgren, I remember your father." She said, "I know you do, Hap." He said, "Sugar Loaf, 1945. She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment over the counter. Then his eyes moved past her. They went up to the brass picture lamp on the back wall, and to the soft, warm cone of light it cast on the dark walnut frame and on the small bronze medal at the center of the frame. Hap looked at the medal for a long moment. He held the wood medallion in his hand, and he looked at the metal one on the wall, and the line of 40 fishermen and their families on the sidewalk behind him began to shuffle through the doorway, and the bell rang again and again and again. The second customer was Glenn Niemi, 61, who had been in her 4th grade class. He bought a license, a quart of leeches, and a small spool of 6-pound monofilament. She handed him a medallion. The third customer was Reed Holm, 61, her nephew, who ran her father's old hardware store. He bought nothing. He wanted only to come inside and stand in the shop. She handed him a medallion. He took it. He pressed it to his lips for 1 second and put it in his shirt pocket without a word. The fourth customer was a young Marine corporal in dress blues with a single silver chevron on his sleeve, perhaps 23 years old, with a small elderly woman on his arm, perhaps 85, in a pale yellow Sunday dress. The young Marine took off his white-peaked cap at the threshold. He held the door for his grandmother. The grandmother stepped through. She looked around the shop. She looked at the maroon-painted metal shelving at the back of the shop, and at the long pine plank counter, and at the bell rope, and at the cedar box of medallions on the counter, and at the framed bronze star on the back wall. Then she looked at Dottie. She said, in a voice so soft Dottie could barely hear it, "Are you Carl Holm's daughter?" Dottie said, "I am." The grandmother said, "My brother carved that perch lure your father carried home from Okinawa. She said it the way you tell a stranger your name on a porch, when you have lived in the same town all your life, and you do not know whether she remembers you." Dottie's hand went to the pine counter to steady herself. The grandmother said, "My name is Eleanor Eldridge Wagstaff. I am Henry Eldridge's sister. He was 20 years old when he died on Sugar Loaf Hill on the 15th of May, 1945. I read the article in the Marquette paper last month about your shop. My grandson Joseph drove me up from Falmouth. I wanted to see where my brother's lure had been." Dottie did not speak for a moment. She stepped out from behind the counter. She walked around the end of the pine plank counter to the wooden stool on the customer side. She gestured to the stool. She said, "Mrs. Wagstaff, please sit down, please sit down." Mrs. Wagstaff sat down on the stool. Her grandson stood at her elbow with his cap in his hand. Dottie walked to the back wall. She lifted the dark walnut frame off its hook. She walked back to the counter. She set the frame on the pine plank in front of Mrs. Wagstaff. She tilted it so the brass picture lamp's light hit it. She said, "Mrs. Wagstaff." He carried it home. He fished with it once. He caught a 16-inch perch in June of 1947 from the public dock at the end of Lake Road, 3 doors that way. He told my mother where it came from. He kept it in this box for 12 years. He brought the box into this shop on the 12th of July, 1959, to show Pop Yancy. He never came back for it. It sat on the back shelf for 67 years. I found it on November 11th last year on a Veterans Day morning. The perch lure is here in the shop. I will get it for you." She walked to the back room. She came back with the small, dark blue cotton drawstring pouch and, in a separate small wooden box she had made over the winter, the hand-carved wooden perch lure with its rusted treble hook and its black dotted yellow and green paint. She set the wooden box on the counter in front of Mrs. Wagstaff. She lifted the lid. Mrs. Wagstaff looked at the perch lure for a long time. She did not touch it. She kept her hands folded on the counter in front of her. She said in a voice that did not break, "It is just like the one he made for me. He carved me one before he left. I still have mine. He must have carved this one for your father after," Dottie said, 3 days before. Mrs. Wagstaff said, 3 days. "Yes." She lifted her right hand. She placed her fingertips on the small lid of the wooden box, not touching the lure itself. She said, 81 years. She said, "Carl Holm was a good man." Dottie said he was. Mrs. Wagstaff said my brother was a good man. Dottie said he was. The 2 women sat with the wooden box between them on the pine counter for a long, quiet moment. The young Marine in the dress blues stood at his grandmother's elbow with his cap in his hand and his eyes on the ceiling, the way a young man who does not know what to do with himself in front of a moment too large for him will look at the ceiling. Behind them, the line of fishermen on the sidewalk had stopped moving. Mose at the counter, Tess at the door, the 11 Curtis Township customers in the shop, and the 28 townspeople and out-of-towners on the sidewalk had gone quiet. Hap Neyberg had taken his cap off again. He was holding the small wood medallion in his hand. Mrs. Wagstaff lifted her head. She looked at Dottie. She said, "You came home." She said it like a teacher would have said it. She had not been a teacher. She had been a librarian in Falmouth, Massachusetts for 41 years, but she said it like a teacher. She said, "You came home, Mrs. Lindgren. You came home and you opened the door." Dottie's eyes filled. She did not let them spill. She blinked once. She said, "Mrs. Wagstaff, coming home is enough." Mrs. Wagstaff said, "Yes, it is." Mrs. Wagstaff lifted her right hand. She held it open across the counter. Dottie reached into the cedar box on the counter, lifted out a sugar loaf medallion, and placed it on Mrs. Wagstaff's open palm. Mrs. Wagstaff closed her fingers around it. She held it against her chest. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Lindgren." She turned to her grandson. She said, "Joseph, will you help your grandmother stand up?" The young Marine corporal in dress blues helped his grandmother to her feet. He put his cap back on. He saluted Dottie once with the slow, careful precision of a young Marine saluting an old Marine he has just met. Dottie did not salute back because she was not a Marine, but she nodded at him gravely, the way a teacher nods at a graduating student. Mrs. Wagstaff turned at the doorway. She said, "Mrs. Lindgren, will you put the box back on your shelf, please? Keep my brother's lure there. He always wanted to be in a fishing shop on a lake." "Keep him here," Dottie said. "I will." Mrs. Wagstaff and her grandson stepped through the door. The bell rang. The line of fishermen moved forward. Dottie carried the wooden box and the dark walnut frame back to the back wall. She hung the frame on its hook. She placed the wooden box of the perch lure on a small shelf below the frame, with a small brass plaque she had had Gus Scanies engrave the week before. Henry Eldridge, PFC USMC, Sugar Loaf, May 15th, 1945. She turned the brass picture lamp on. The soft, warm cone of light fell on the bronze star and on the small wooden perch above it on the lower shelf. She walked back to the front of the shop. She stood behind the pine plank counter. Tess was at the front door welcoming the next family in line, a young father with 2 children in waders and a baby on his hip. Mose was at the live bait tank in the back, scooping leeches for an older fisherman in a faded Detroit Tigers cap. The bell rang. The cash register chimed. The percolator hissed. The Royal Crown cooler hummed. Dottie placed both hands flat on the pine counter. She looked at the long line of fishermen still on the sidewalk on the warm Memorial Day morning of May 30th, 2027, in the small Upper Peninsula village of Curtis, Michigan, on the east shore of Big Manistique Lake, in the 75th year of her life. She allowed herself a single, small smile. It was the first smile she had smiled in 2 years. She said, out loud, in her own clear teacher's voice, the same voice with which she had read aloud to 42 years of 4th graders, the same voice with which she had spoken to her father's gray granite headstone in the Curtis Township Cemetery 6.5 months before. "We are open.